Hello, hi, and welcome to another episode of The Emma Gunn Show, and an episode where I'm going to talk a little bit more about a feature that I wrote on my Substack. I will put the link to that feature in the show notes and underneath this video, but it is about the news last week that Stephen Bartlett's podcast, Diary of a CEO, has been found to be spreading, or there to have been instances where they have published misleading health information. And obviously, if health information is misleading, it could be dangerous. Now, I wrote the piece on Substack, not about the particular specifics of the information that has been discussed on Stephen's podcast, because that is not my expertise. But I wrote about my reaction to the fact that this kind of thing was being called out. And quite a few people have replied to that piece, not only on Substack, but they've messaged me on Instagram. When I first posted the BBC headline, I was inundated. I was actually out for the day and I got back and I was like, what on earth has happened? And I'd forgotten that I had posted this, just a screen grab of the BBC headline, and just said, I won't go into a rant about this, but my goodness, it's about time. And I'd completely forgotten that I posted it. So when I got back and saw hundreds of DMs, I thought, what have I done? Who have I been seen with? I don't know. Have I been linked to Harry Styles finally? Anyway, no, it was in reaction to this. And so many people saying, I've been saying this for ages. It's about time. I'm so glad this has happened. And many, many more things. I was actually quite surprised at the depth of feeling. And I think that's a key thing that we must come back to, the depth of feeling. But the reason I wanted to talk about it is because I have been podcasting for 9 years. It will be 9 years in April 2025. And so I feel as though I have a pretty good insider perspective on podcasting, in as much as anyone can, because if there's anything I've learned about the podcasting space in those nearly 9 years, it's that there is no formula for success. There is no sort of magic to make a podcast go viral, although sort of, kind of. But in the early days, and the reason why I embrace podcasting as a medium is because, and this actual episode is a perfect example. I wrote a piece on my Substack, and as I was writing it, I was thinking, I won't put that in because that'll add 3 paragraphs. I won't put that in because that'll add this bit. And what I was aware of is that we were getting into 1,000 words, 1,500 words, 2,000 words. You're asking a lot of people's time. People have to give you full focus on the written word. But with something like a podcast, with something like this, if you choose to watch it, you can sit and watch it. You can also be looking at your phone, or you can be folding your laundry. And if you're choosing to listen to it, you can be listening to it while you're commuting or while you're doing housework. Like, it's something that is in partnership, that you can do in tandem with other tasks. So it doesn't require as much. And so when I wrote that piece, I thought, okay, well, I can't go into the nitty gritty of it because it will go on forever and then it will take days to write. But let's just put the basics out there. And what I was trying to say is that, yes, the medium of podcasting has become warped and bastardized by moving away from its original intention. And I think the original intention, it was certainly my intention when I came to podcasting, was to platform conversations, people and stories that wouldn't have made the mainstream media. And I say that as somebody who has worked and continues to work in the mainstream media. I have appeared on live radio, recorded radio, live TV, pre-recorded TV. I've written for newspapers, magazines, for online titles. I've got a pretty good raft of experience of all of the various different broadcast channels. And I think podcasting might be my favorite. And in the early days, it was because those in-depth interviews with the founders of the beauty companies that I had great relationships with, from writing about their products and brands for years in print media, the actual story of the individual rarely got told. And again, that's another thing we can come into, because I think those stories did get told, but they had to have a particular rhythm in order to catch. And I think you'll understand what I say when we get to that bit. But what I really wanted to talk about was the changing landscape. And if you've been here for a while, you'll know that I have, over the last, actually it's now been 2 years, I've been trying to find my footing with the podcast, because I felt very comfortable with the podcast for 6 years. And then it felt like my footing went, because I couldn't compete with those people coming to the podcast space with video. So to put it into context, when I started this podcast, I invested, I think it was £119 in a Yeti microphone. And I already had my laptop, and GarageBand, the editing suite that I used to edit the podcast, was already on the laptop. So all I needed was that investment. And I remember thinking, guys, over £100, that's such a lot of money. And I just used to take my laptop and the Yeti microphone, and I'd go out and I'd capture poor recordings, but great conversations, I thought, with the people who I've been writing about for years, like James Reed, like Michelle from Alpha H, like Davis Factor from Smashbox, all of these incredible people that I knew through the beauty industry, but their stories never got more than, I don't know, a couple of sentences in print. I got to give them an hour or more and just really hear their stories. And I love that. That's one of my favorite things. I think that's why podcasting is one of my favorite mediums, because you're not producing content for time. You're not editing as you go. You're listening. You're letting something breathe. You're letting it kind of blossom, if you like. And then as time went on, I went from those conversations with beauty people to dabbling into health conversations. And this is kind of where we get to with the Stephen Bartlett story, because the issue that people have with Stephen and his podcast, Diary of a CEO, is the health experts that he has platformed. People like the Glucose Goddess, people recently who have said that a keto diet can reverse cancer. I mean, things like that. Just, again, be careful with my words, because I'm not sure exactly what was said and I'm not quoting directly, but essentially the thing that you could take away was that make this one lifestyle change and you'll be completely fine. Now, when I moved into recording episodes of the podcast about health, very much centered on women's health. It was about hormones, and it was about perimenopause, and it was about menopause, and it was about PCOS. And I did this from the perspective of somebody who, albeit a trained journalist, is also a human being who was diagnosed with PCOS as a teenager, had real struggles with some quite severe symptoms, and felt the real challenge of navigating those. Particularly, a lot of what I feel very sad about for my poor teenage self is that I didn't know how to articulate what I was feeling, and I didn't know whether it was normal, and there was nowhere I could really find this information. The only thing you would ever read about PCOS in print titles was that it was the secret disease that could be making you fat because of insulin resistance, and because Victoria Beckham had PCOS. It was sort of it would get talked about in that sort of context, which wasn't helpful for somebody like me who didn't look like Victoria Beckham. He had terrible skin. He was very overweight, who had alopecia, who had facial hair. And so when I was in this position to be able to create podcasts about health, it came from a place of real curiosity. And it came from a place of creating something that would be, I wish I had had this information at my fingertips when I was a teenager going through this. And that's why I had conversations with brilliant doctors like Dr. Seher Roked, Dr. Elaine McQuaid, who I found to give very reassuring, helpful, reasonable information. And one of the things that a good expert does is they don't give you sound bites, they don't give you headlines, because they actually discuss something at length. And moving way forward to years later, when I interviewed an expert in narcissism like Dr. Ramani Devasula, one of the things that is almost annoying as an interviewer about a guest like Ramani, although nothing is annoying about her because she's probably one of the best people I've ever encountered via my podcast, is that she doesn't get to the point, because it's not about that. She answers a question in a way where she sets it up, she explains it, she breaks it down, and then she explains why something is so, because she's a lecturer, and that's how we learn. It's the context. And that's what's missing from a lot of the conversations in the health space specifically at the moment, is that where they're just removing context and taking you straight to a solution, in inverted commas. So when I started creating all of those podcasts about women's health, I did a few, then I did a few more. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to create a series on menopause. And it was around the same time, or a little bit before, menopause had its viral moment, where it went from being something that people didn't talk about to being something that people did talk about. It was slightly before, or around the time maybe Davina was talking about it, Davina McCall. And it was definitely getting louder. The conversation was getting louder. And then it became about who's the best menopause doctor. Not let's speak to a variety. Let's let somebody engage in these podcasts, take from them what will be useful, given their symptoms or their circumstance or the questions that they have, and let them go to their doctor armed with that. It became about getting the most popular menopause doctor on the podcast. And that was when I definitely felt a shift that I did not enjoy, because it went from being about genuine curiosity, creating episodes that would be helpful, creating episodes that you would assume that the listener would engage with in full, and then go away and think about it. You're not giving people answers. You were giving them a huge amount of information. So rather than going to their doctor, having spent a lot of time on Dr. Google, they might have listened to a podcast like mine or someone else's, because I wasn't the only person doing it. And they might then say, listen, I've heard about this. And rather than a headline top result on Google, it might be something a little bit more informed. The whole idea was to give people information that was then empowering for them to go and take ownership and have agency over their health issues. But there was a very sharp shift towards just getting the most popular menopause expert on, and getting the menopause expert on who had the biggest following. I don't particularly subscribe to that, and I think that I won't go into it, but I think if you have been watching the menopause space, you'll see how that has backfired for some people. But I do think that there have been some absolutely brilliant conversations around menopause that have been so helpful for people, but it got turned into not just the sort of clickbaity title of this is how to, I don't even know what the clickbait title would be because I'm not very good at them, but it sort of went from here's some really wonderful information. Here's like having an hour-long consultation with a doctor that you don't get because you get 8 to 12 minutes with a GP. Here's what it's like to sit in front of somebody and actually interrogate them, and as a journalist, try to ask them everything relevant to somebody on the cusp of or experiencing perimenopause, menopause. And I thought that was great. And to this end, I'll say that one of the first people, and obviously she's a friend of mine, but one of the first people to ever bring menopause to the mainstream was Andrea McLean, the TV presenter. She was the host of the panel host for Loose Women for 13 years. She had a menopause journey and she wrote a book about it. Several years later, everyone's writing books about it. And one of the reasons why I like Andrea is because she hasn't capitalized on that. She said, that was my journey. I have encapsulated it in this book. I will answer anyone's questions, but I'm not going to make all of my content about menopause. And I think that is a really honorable and brilliant way to approach content. And I hope it is sort of similar to the way that I approach my content, which brings me on to something else. Criticism. So when I created those podcasts about menopause, I didn't get a huge amount of feedback, not at all. And then I had Davinia Taylor on the podcast. Now, I'd had Davinia on previously, really early doors. She was very nice. She was very gracious. I, at the time, was very much into exploring the idea of things like Wim Hof and cold water therapy and all of these things that was away from the mainstream, but you didn't have to spend money on, that might make you feel better. So will blasting yourself with cold water for a minute at the end of your shower every day make you feel good? Will it release endorphins? If that's true, it's a small price to pay for feeling great, isn't it? So I was going down that sort of road, and Davinia was way ahead of me on that journey. She is what they call a biohacker, and she was doing all sorts. And we had a really great conversation. She invited me to her house in North London. We had a really good chat at the time. It was very much before I had got on, faced my binge eating issues. So I was just looking to her, I just want to live like you. I just want to do everything that you're doing. And obviously that's not the way to make yourself well. But no one really fed back on that episode particularly. And then she came on again, and it was when she had found her footing with her topic. She had worked with various researchers and all sorts of experts, and was being far more definitive and absolute about what she thought would work. And the feedback I had about that, in particular when she said obesity is a slow death, I was inundated. I have never had so much response to an Instagram post, a podcast, or anything that I have ever put out there, just because I isolated that one quote and said, what do you think of this? Because it was quite when she said it to me, I thought, blimey, wow, okay, That's one way to look at it. I'd never thought about it like that before. I had voice notes from people on Instagram telling me I shouldn't be able to publish my podcast. I had really quite venomous, awful messages. And this is what I wanted to say about criticism, because I don't know what Stephen Bartlett is like. I met him once. He was very charming. I've seen him speak. He's extremely engaging, and I'm not criticizing Stephen as a person, but he is a businessman. I am not by nature. If I wanted to increase my audience, increase my engagement, increase my likes, and therefore increase my profitability, because brands will advertise with me and on the podcast, the larger my following, the larger my reach, all of that kind of stuff. I would have been a genius if I'd capitalized on Davinia. I would have gone, right, find me, although I would have been talking to myself because I don't have a team. Right, I would have found 5 more biohackers and I would have platformed them immediately, because I would know that by platforming those sorts of people who say quite bold things, who make quite bold statements, who are prepared to say things like obesity is a slow death, I had the evidence that that's how I get my show, not to go viral, but to get a bigger audience, to get a bigger reach. And I suspect that's what's happened with Diary of a CEO. I think that it started out as a really great podcast, but I think I've had a lot of feedback from people saying it just started to fill a formula. Women always cried. People were always, particularly famous people, were always steered towards mining their trauma for a social media clip. And the health claims got ridiculous. And let's not forget, this started out as a podcast about business. It was about Diary of a CEO, not about health. But guess what did really well? Health content. Guess what did even better? Health content that polarized people and created criticism. So if you follow the data, if you follow the analytics, and if you go for the likes, then you will increase your audience. And that is exactly what's happened. And one of the things that is galling, but completely understandable, you can understand why it's happened, is in that feature, it said that Stephen will make £20 million, or is set to make £20 million through advertising on the podcast. I mean, that just makes you realize it's about following the algorithm. It's about not following the content that is honorable, has integrity, and is correct. It's about following a pattern that will get you likes and get you engagement and get you listens. And then, of course, so let's park that for a second. The changing landscape of podcasting is, and I said this a couple of times in the article, when podcasting started, it was people who weren't in the mainstream. It was voices and people who you didn't see on your television, who you didn't hear on your radios. They might have been someone like me who had a presence in media, print and digital media. People like Elizabeth Day, people like Emma Gannon, people who you might have read or known about or seen or whatever. But it wasn't famouses, as I call them. It wasn't famous people. It wasn't celebrities. It was very much a kind of a new avenue that people who were excited about it kind of leaned into it. And again, I would say that England or the UK is about 2 to 3 years behind America in the podcasting space. And so when I joined it, it was already in full flow. You had people like Joe Rogan, before Joe did exactly the same thing that Diary of a CEO has done, having just these really quite brilliant conversations. Some of the best podcasts I've listened to were Joe Rogan's early ones. And if that makes you think poorly of me, I'll take it. But he came from a place of genuine curiosity, but there was also kind of this very relaxed vibe. He would rib his guests a little bit. Tim Ferriss, I used to absolutely love. I was struggling with my mental health at the time, and he gave me fantastic perspectives and resources on things like depression and anxiety. And I think at least once a week about him saying, depression is an intense focus on the past, and an intense and unhealthy focus on the past, and anxiety is an intense and unhealthy focus on the future. And that really helps me whenever I'm feeling a little bit rattled. I think, okay, what am I focusing too much on here? Am I focusing too far on the past? There's nothing I can do about that. Or am I focusing massively on what might happen? Because both of those things, they're not good for me. So those podcasts were fantastic. But what we've seen as well is that they have also, in the American space, you've got superstar podcasters. So you've got Call Her Daddy. You've got Joe Rogan. Tim Ferriss, I would say, probably still does very well, but he hasn't tried to occupy that space. There's people like Heather McDonald who have been talking about pop culture and Real Housewives for years, who do it very, very well, but who have been somewhat eclipsed by famous people coming in and doing exactly the same thing. So there's been this shift towards sort of this just the more popular you are, the more successful you're going to be with podcasting. And it isn't regulated. I said this in the piece as well. It is not subject to Ofcom. It is not like magazines or digital titles where you have somebody who proofreads your copy and you have someone who sense checks it, fact checks it, so that nothing potentially defamatory or incorrect can hit the airwaves or indeed hit the page. So it's all a little bit of a wild, wild west. But here's the thing. Popularity propagates trust. So let's face it, if you are curious about a health topic and you think, oh, there might be a podcast on this, and you search it into your podcast app and the results come up, you are absolutely going to, I say absolutely as if you are more likely to choose the episode of the podcast that health topic is discussed on, or that expert that you like is on, if it is hosted by somebody that you know or are familiar with. And so the podcasting space has gone from being this quite democratic space where the quality of the episodes and the quality of the content, the quality of the guests were what pushed you up the charts and expanded your reach and increased your listenership, to being how big your social media following is. And listen, as much as this might sound like a wine made of sour grapes, and there is an element of that, it's also the way the cookie crumbles. I'm not saying it's unfair. It's just what happens. And a couple of years ago, I decided to invest in video. I thought that I want to increase my numbers. The podcast was doing really well. I was getting great guests. I'll add video to the mix. I spent 6 months and an eye-watering amount of money creating videos that were beautifully produced, but it was absolutely pointless. I might as well have just thrown the money away. It did nothing to increase listenership or reach or anything like that, because you can we're talking 5 figures and not low 5 figures, we're talking high 5 figures, that it did nothing, because you need to have a big social media following. You need to get those episodes pushed out on podcasts. You need to create the social media clips, because you can create an hour-long video, but you then need to create loads of little clips in a different format, by the way, so it costs way more money, that you can then put out on social media. Unless you've got that strategy in tandem with creating the video, it's just going to fall flat. And I learned that, unfortunately, the hard way. So if you are able to come to the podcasting space with the budget to create video, then amazing. And just to say, that Yeti mic that cost 120 quid or whatever it was, that meant that my cost per episode creation, because I made it at home and because I did all the editing, was a couple of pounds. When I was doing video production, it was costing between £750 and £1,000 per episode. So it just goes to show you that if you are entering that space, you're entering it from a point of privilege. And privilege, I think, or not, but you're able to. And if that's privilege, it's privilege. Again, not a wine of sour grapes. I'm just stating how it is, and how it's such a shame that this brilliant platform has perhaps lost its way a little bit. Not lost its way a little bit, but it's almost like you can't find the good stuff, because the good stuff, the best episode that you might hear about a particular health topic or with a particular guest might not be the one with the biggest listenership. But do you know what I mean? That's the thing. It's kind of, it went from being democratic, and now if you go into a podcast app, if you look at all of the top podcasts, they're usually out of Goal Hanger. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I'm not guilty of it because I think they're excellent podcasts. The rest is politics. The rest is Politics US, The Sport Agents. All of those podcasts, The Rest is History, they're all out of the same company. There's Global, who produce a lot of podcasts. There's also, what's the other one? Like BBC. There are so many big companies producing podcasts, and it's just, I know people who, and it's great for them. It's not how I wanted to work, but they go to a studio, they sit down, have a conversation, they leave, and someone else or a team of other people do everything else. But I think I'm very much about the content first. And that's why I always strive to bring really brilliant guests to the podcast. And that has become a little bit more challenging because I don't have the numbers of the bigger podcasts anymore. I don't get the guests that I would hope to sometimes, because they'll come back to me and say, what's your reach? What's your average downloads? And when I say, they're like, they only do over 100,000. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a shame. We could have had a great conversation, but okay. It's become like that, which is disappointing for me, but it's just the way the cookie crumbles. And I think it's what happened with YouTube. It's what happened with everything. I was even talking to a friend at the weekend. I worked on OK Magazine for 10 years. And at the time when I worked on OK Magazine, it outsold the closest rival by about 1.5 copies per week. It was ridiculous. It sold so much. I saw people have a fight over a copy of OK and a WH Smith. When there were big wedding issues, it would sell well over 1 million issues a week, which is just unheard of. You just don't hear about that these days. So in the time that I was at OK Magazine, there was OK and Hello. And there was also OK Hello. And then there was, and Heat, which, again, amazing. But so OK, Hello and Heat, they were kind of the three. And then it was OK, Heat, Closer, Hello. Then Now Magazine, then Star Magazine, then Look Magazine, and all of these other magazines that would do a very similar thing. They would bring celebrity gossip, celebrity news to the newsstand every week. And it was brilliant. And it was a booming market, which is why so many in that space, so many titles could have a fair crack at the whip, because there were so many people who wanted it. Some people bought all of the magazines, some people had their favorites. But gradually what happened over time, and social media killed it a lot, is that why would you read a magazine article about what Kim Kardashian is up to when you can just look at her Instagram or you can watch her TV show? So the landscape changed, and now it's gone back to, if you go to the shelves and you go and look at the celebrity titles, it's gone from being about 20 to going back to OK, Hello, and Heat, and a few others. Oh, is Heat still there? I don't know. I haven't picked up a magazine for a very long time. So this is just how it works. These are the cycles. So again, not trying to be critical of anyone in particular, or it's unfair. It's just how it goes. And there are brilliant podcasts out there that are funded and do have all the bells and whistles. And that's absolutely great. And they shouldn't be criticized for it. They're creating absolutely incredible content. But in the Substack feature, I did also talk about something else that I've noticed. And again, it's at odds with how I approach creating content. So I've seen it coming for a while, and I've sort of, I don't like, to me, it smells funky. Something's rotten in the state of Denmark when I see this happening. But it's when podcasters have gone from being inquisitive interviewers to being gurus themselves. And again, I think that might be something that people felt was happening with Diary of a CEO. Indeed, earlier this year, I went to a panel talk, and Stephen was on the panel, and he was presenting a lot of his guests' expertise via his own experience, which kind of almost attached him to the research, which I thought was quite interesting. In a weird way, I felt like the way that he presented it was something he had actually potentially almost choreographed, because he came across in a very similar fashion to someone like Johan Hari. Now, Johan, for my money, is one of the best researchers and presents his research in the most incredible, easy to follow and accessible way. But he never wears that research as his own. He just talks about it in a way that's very convincing. He doesn't then say, what he will do is he'll set it up and he'll say, so in such and such a date, so-and-so expert conducted this experiment where his hypothesis was X would lead to Y. And this is the way that he tried it. And this is what he found out she found out at the end of the experiment. And so what he is a brilliant conduit to information for a listener or for an interviewer to then have further thoughts, feelings, and questions. But what I've definitely noticed is this idea that it then becomes, so-and-so did this, and so I tried it, and this is what I found. And so you end up having this great research followed up with anecdotal experience, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's this idea of guru by proxy. And I was thinking about this the other day because there's a documentary. Again, I haven't watched a lot of what I should be watching at the moment because it's Christmas time, but I've been busy, I've been out. But there's a TV show, and I think it might have already aired, and it's with Matt and Emma Willis in the UK, and it's an they examine the relationship between mobile phones, social media and children, and whether children do indeed need mobile telephones. And last week, when I was getting ready, I would have the news on and I'd see various experts, a lot of them podcasters, coming on to talk about phone use. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And again, as a journalist, you do have sort of guns for hire, if you like. You're like, oh, we need someone to comment on this. Who was the last person who did it really well? Great, get them in. So you don't spread, once you found someone, you don't always spread the net that wide anymore because you think that's the person. But then funnily enough, last week I was at an event and I spoke to the headmistress of a school and I said, okay, I don't have kids, but I'm very curious because every generation thinks that the one that follows them is somehow defunct or slightly broken. You are with children every single day. What do you think? And we ended up talking about mobile telephones. And what she told me in the space of that 5-minute conversation was so much more interesting and valuable than what I had heard on every single news program. Because on every single news program, most of the information was stuff that you kind of already knew. But actually, someone who's literally day to day asking kids not to do this, telling them not to do that, saying to parents, really, they don't need a phone. And if they do have one, please don't let them use Snapchat for these reasons. That was so much more interesting to me than it shortens attention span. Just we've heard it all before. And I think there is this weird thing where we feel comforted by an expert telling us something that we already know. But then we also get bored of information. And so we're desperate for the new thing, which I think, again, Diary of a CEO, one health expert after one health expert after another health expert, and they contradict each other, which isn't particularly great. And I've just felt particularly uncomfortable about this idea that you are a guru or you are the voice of the topic that you bring to the table. I've talked about so many things on my podcast, and I've had friends say to me, you know that you'd have a much bigger following if you just talked about weight loss all the time. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want to. And also when I did, people had a go at me and they were like, yeah, but you would have more engagement because you'd have positive engagement and you'd have negative engagement. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that. I just want to create hopefully good episodes. But there is this idea that if you are given a voice, if you're given a platform, that you are then now sort of exalted. And we do it with celebrities, and you can kind of understand that, but we're doing it with experts at the moment, and I just find it displeasing, is what I would say. So popularity is a huge thing. The idea of a guru, like you want to be the go-to person for a particular topic. Yeah, I do understand it, but I just don't think that the end user, as in the listener, the viewer, the reader, is actually getting a fair deal if that's the motive for platforming someone, whether it's or platforming a topic or talking about something in a specific way. I will say this. I think that I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying this. Okay, do it. Screw it. There are a lot of people who are in the expert space, and I am putting actually, no, I'm not going to put it in inverted commas, because as much as there might be people that I would never have on the show because I think they're charlatans, #conscious DJ, there are also legitimate experts who I think are a fame whores, who I think are desperate to be famous, and you can smell it a mile off. And when the intention of sharing your information isn't to be helpful, but it's to have people go, oh my God, you know so much. Oh my God, you're the best. That for me as a creator is a real turn off. And I will say that in the beauty space, again, naming no names, but if I meet someone and they are an expert and they're qualified and all of these things, I will then say to a few friends in the industry, are they legit? And I will tell you, it happens more often than you might think, where someone will say, really quite knowledgeable, but desperate to do as many podcasts as possible and get as many followers as possible. And that's not to say that what they have to say isn't relevant, but it just means that that person will talk to anybody and take any platform because they want a public profile. So I will say that I have had some of my best guests are people who don't do that. But I think that the information and the value they add when you do speak to them is immeasurable. So Chris Voss, he is the FBI negotiator. Whenever people ask me about my podcast, I say he's one of the conversations I'm most proud of, partly because it took me over a year to get the podcast, because I would email and I keep getting rejected. I'd email, I keep getting rejected. And I was like, God, I've watched his masterclass. Okay, I'll try this. Is it out of the question that Chris Vast could do it on this day? Like, I'd try all of the techniques. And then in the end, I just kept tagging him in posts until he replied. And then he gave me a different email address, and within a month it was done. But he is so knowledgeable. He was an FBI negotiator for many years. He has then taken the skills he learned from kidnap negotiation, hostage negotiation, all of that. He has taken that and parlayed it into business. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And so what he does, and I watched his masterclass, which I recommend anybody watch, is he essentially comes from the position of every conversation is a negotiation. Every conversation is a negotiation. And these are the 3 things that you can do to help you get the best out of that conversation. And I hang on every word he says. His advice is brilliant. It's presented in the most incredible way, because as well as being wonderful at being able to read the other person, to get them to show their hand, if you like, he's also a master of what speed to talk at, what kind of questions to ask, all of those things. It's invaluable. Now, I'm sure Chris and his team at Black Swan could turn all of that into, and they do have social media. It's not like they don't have a following, but they could make it really snappy. They could sell it. They could turn it into something, and they don't. They're just kind of like, come here, get the information, but also like hone your skills. I found the conversation with him to be absolutely one of the most rewarding conversations I've ever brought to the podcast, because I think that if you listen to that, if you retain some of what he says, you will fundamentally be able to have better conversations with the people you love, the people you work with, the people that you encounter just day to day. And so for me, I think it's invaluable. I also think Evie Pomporis, who was a Secret Service agent, she worked in the security detail for the Bushes senior, the other Bushes, the Obamas and the Clintons. She is a formidable woman who worked in the NYPD. I got to see the world through the eyes of somebody that I probably wouldn't have come into contact with had I not had her on the podcast. And again, a conversation I come back to time and time again about emotional resilience, about how you've got to park some feelings in order to be able to think clearly. It's just an invaluable conversation. And again, I'll put the links to these in the show notes. I mentioned them earlier, but when I talked about health podcasts, Dr. Seher Roked, Dr. Elaine McQuaid, Dr. Anis Mukherjee, again, none of these people are courting huge amounts of fame. None of them are desperate to be on This Morning as the health expert. None of that, not that that means that you're whatever, but none of them are desperate to be the queen of menopause or the queen of emotional resilience or the king of negotiation. They're just like, this is what I know. And if you like it, come back, there's more. And that's what I really, really like. It's almost like it's become really aggressive. And to that point, and I'll get off this now, I just want to talk about platforming and privilege, because I mentioned privilege a minute ago. I talked about podcasting being democratic, and the barriers to entry were very low because it was extremely inexpensive to actually become a podcaster. It cost, as I said, £1 per episode. But if you look, forget about the big studios who are producing podcasts. If you look at the people who are on a pedestal or exalted for having great podcasts now, I am stunned at how many people are just so crazily wealthy that I'm like, of course it's nice to think that you might have something in common with a multi-millionaire, but I'm just astounded at the amount of people. Again, I'm sort of grimacing if you're watching this on YouTube, because it's not about sour grapes. It's a little bit. It's not about saying this is wrong. It's just saying this is happening, and is anybody noticing? Because if you look at a lot of the big podcasts, it's people who are already so financially comfortable, it's sickening. Not sickening. It's just so financially comfortable that they don't need to podcast. But also we're sort of adding so much value to their voices. And if insert rich podcast host here has a guest on, they must be legitimate. And again, I sort of alluded to that already. But if you trust a podcast host, you are therefore going to trust a podcast guest. But that means, again, I talked about this in the piece, I wrote for a health magazine, and 1 month we'd talk about one thing, and the next month we'd talk about something that completely contradicted it. And the month after that, we'd do something similar. So it was just very discombobulating for the reader. it was discombobulating for me as the writer, but it's discombobulating if you're constantly saying that one thing is true and then contradicting it, but then not actually acknowledging that you've contradicted it. So again, I think this has happened in business. And again, talking about Stephen Bartlett, his podcast started out as Diary of a CEO because that was what people are really interested in. I think that we have fetishized and glamorized entrepreneurship and making money out of the normal way of making money, i.e. from a side hustle or having an incredible idea, which isn't the kind of business that keeps a country upright, by the way. But we fetishized it. So again, nothing against Trinny Woodall as a person. She's been on the show many, many times. But Trinny has created a business and she has done an incredible job, and I have a huge amount of respect for her. But one of the things that she said at the beginning is that she had to sell a lot of her clothes in order to finance it. She didn't have a home, she was renting, and she sold a lot of her clothes. Now, I can tell you I've been doing Vinted for a year and I've made about £1,200. So that's not going to start a business. So we at some point have to acknowledge that if you are funding a business with the money that you've made from selling your clothes, you ain't selling Primark. It's not come from the high street. And yet, as much as I celebrate and think that she's absolutely brilliant and what she's done is phenomenal, and she's going to reap those rewards, I'm sure, for many generations, I just think that we have to almost just sort of see it. You have to be able to see it. Let's celebrate the person who worked on the shop floor. I mean, I'm talking about Caroline Hirons here, and it's almost a bad example because she's as big as, if not bigger than Trinny in terms of success. But like, there's graft that's gone in there. She didn't have, I'm sorry, Caroline, and I don't think you're going to listen to this, but I'm sure that if a few years ago you'd sold all your clothes to start Skin Rocks, I don't think you would have had the nest egg you wanted. And I think that we're friends enough for me to say that to you. I'd say that to your face. But that all I'm saying is that just seems to be something that we're doing. We're sort of grotesquely platforming really rich, privileged voices. And I think, again, it's sort of, and then it sort of moves into this guru phase, and it's just really skanky. So this isn't to do down anybody who is successful. This is just to sort of explain what's happening with podcasting. And if you are engaging with this podcast, then you probably are somebody who has either stuck around or has found it in a way. And I really appreciate you staying here, because given the landscape, you are probably being inundated with plenty of other options that are probably far more appealing and look a lot better, because I'm going to edit this and I'm not very good at that. So I talked about it on Substack. I've elaborated a little bit more here, maybe a bit too much, but hey, I've spent a long time on this podcast trying not to say something controversial. And again, I talked about Davinia and how I got a lot of negative feedback for that. I also had James Smith on the podcast. James Smith, again, was really polarizing. And then I talked quite a lot about my weight loss because I had was overcoming in recovery from an eating disorder. I was really proud of that. Those are three things that I got criticized for. And I had a Facebook group. I'm not really using it anymore because no one was really in it. The only time people would use the Facebook group would be to say, is it just me or is Emma talking about weight loss too much? And then people would chime in and say, yeah, I've noticed that too. And I think, oh, okay, all right. And then when Davinia came on, people would say, I can't believe that you let her say that. You used to be fat. Imagine how you'd feel if someone said that to you when you were still fat. And again, people would chime in. And then the other thing was when I had James Smith on, people got really angry about that too, because James is an interesting character. He's got some interesting stuff to say. Do I agree with all of it? No. But do I think he is the kind of character who is thought-provoking and can say something that can make you see a part of your life in a new way that could be useful? Yes, I do, which is why I platformed him. But I got so much criticism. And so I'm thinking the three things that I've had the most feedback about are criticisms and negative things. So I can totally see how putting content out there that gets people riled up is the way to get engagement and likes. But I just want to say that if you love podcasting, try and look for those people who aren't seeking out the headlines, because there are some really brilliant shows out there. And I will always come back to, it's a completely different genre from mine, but Red Handed, Hannah and Saruti started their podcast in a cupboard, and I'm so happy that they are now making so much money and traveling the world with their podcast. They just did a tour of Australia. Their success is totally, totally deserved because they've stayed true to themselves, and obviously true crime is a very popular genre and people obviously like the way that they do it. They put so much time and effort and research into each and every single episode. They present stuff really factually. They also bring enough of themselves into it. I think that they are absolute geniuses at how they do it, and they are doing very, very well indeed. But I was at the podcast show earlier this year and everybody was like, "Ooh, so-and-so's over there, insert famous podcaster there." And I was standing there with Hannah, who arguably has one of the most popular podcasts in the world. And nobody was batting an eyelid because Hannah hasn't courted the press. Suruthi hasn't courted the press. You wouldn't necessarily know what Hannah and Suruthi look like unless you watch their podcast, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And so that's all. I think podcasting has swung so far one way, and I think it will swing back the other way. And I always look to America for what's going to happen next. And maybe it's going to take a while because shows like Call Her Daddy, she just had Kamala Harris on. Alex Cooper had Kamala Harris on before the election, and Joe Rogan had Donald Trump on before the election. So clearly the power of the superstar podcaster is not going to wane anytime soon. But if you are somebody who enjoys podcasts, try to explore around what you see in the charts and what you're fed in your feed, because you might actually find something a bit more interesting. And rather than making you angry or making you believe falsehoods, you might actually find something that resonates. And it might not be with somebody famous, it might be with somebody boring and ordinary like me. Anyway, that's sort of my elaboration on the piece that I wrote on Substack. I'm sure that you will have thoughts and feelings about this because I know that you're a very clever, thoughtful, articulate bunch. And thank you already to everybody who has commented on the Substack and on my Instagram and DM'd me and emailed me about it already. You can email me at office@emmaguns.com. You can go to my Substack. You can DM me on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. You always say the best things. You always say really interesting things. And you make me think, and I'm sure, as you have probably felt during this episode, I have been squirming a little bit saying some of what I've said. But because I'm not used to it, I don't like to say things that might cause upset. But I felt strongly enough about this to actually point a few things out. And I'm just hoping that Claire Coleman listens to this because she'll tell me where I could have tightened it up a little bit or said something else. But anyway, the point being, I'd really love to hear from you because you do help me shape the show. And as much as you have every right to tell me if you think I've talked about weight loss too much, you also have every right to tell me where I could be going next or what you would like to hear. So please do. I'd love to hear from you. It would be so nice. And can you believe it's after 12 o'clock and I haven't had coffee yet, so I should probably leave you here. But please do. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And if you do have any thoughts and feelings about anything that I've just said, please do take the time to get in touch with me via any of the channels that I've said, office@emmaguns.com, underneath this video, on Spotify, or DM me on Instagram. It would be so, so good to hear from you. Anyway, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I will see you on the next one.